Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing The Power of the Dog. This was directed by Jane Campion. This is Jane Campion's first film in a really long time, and she's kind of gone for, or at least people are saying she's going for more like a Western film. But I do think in modern day we use the term Western quite loosely. I do think there are elements of Western, absolutely, but I do see this more as like a chamber piece, more kind of a methodical, tense piece, very attuned to more the textures and the surfaces, and I think what she's using a lot of that to sink the hooks in terms of suspense. So it's more kind of compelling in a way that's more underlying. At least that seems what she's going for. My experience watching this film was very, very unique, and I'm always curious to hear how other people's viewing experience was, just because, you know, it's all over the map. I mean, I had so many highs and lows. There were moments where I felt like I wanted to laugh and I wasn't sure if I was supposed to. There were times where I felt, disoriented, both in good ways and maybe negative ways. I definitely felt confusion. But yeah, in terms of just my mood, I felt all over the place, which is unique because the film itself kind of maintains a pretty similar mood throughout it. But it's more kind of where the narrative takes you that causes me to shift my focus, causes me to realize that the film isn't as simple as it seems at first glance. The film is very fragmented, I think, in its style, and it can be disorienting. I mean, just in terms of the timeline, because it's not showing you, plot point by plot point, like, a lot of movies do, a lot of more mainstream movies do. This one just kind of gives you an impression of it. You're capturing more of the moods and the feelings, as I said, and more the experience through the textures and the biting tension. But even though I do feel a little bit mixed on it, I found myself very compelled by it. Very compelled by the aesthetic in particular, just because it carries a lot of everything. It carries, as I said, a lot of the tension. There is a real visual power and scope to this film, a very meditative beauty, and it feels very much removed from real life. And there's just this sense of isolation between the characters. It's like they're all living under the same roof, and yet they're not really crossing paths in an emotional sense. But I think we start to realize, at least I did very early on, that this is going to be a story that deals heavily with masculinity and what it means to these characters, in contrast to femininity. And, again, it's just going to be a consistent thread. And the character of Phil is going to personify our idea of masculinity, at least in the beginning of things. And I really like the way they establish his character with just sound effects. It's like every time he walks into the house, it's him immediately. There's just like a heft, he's very loud. You hear the boots just stomping. Everything about him is separate from the rest of these characters. And, obviously there's a big contrast between him and his brother. That is established, I think, from the very first scene, because his brother is, just kind of ordinary, nothing particularly interesting about him. He's not very smart or talented, but he is this kind of stereotypical sort of cowboy from the onset of the film. And just looking at the way everything looks in the film, this film is shot in New Zealand. It's supposed to take place in Montana in 1925. It doesn't feel like Montana to me. It does not feel like America to me. And yet I didn't mind that at all. In fact, I actually kind of liked that. It added a weird sort of grace in contrast to all this prickliness and hardness that's going on in the interiors of the characters. And it felt very removed in a way. And those expansive landscapes, as gorgeous and open as they are, when you have that kind of freedom, you feel suddenly sort of lost. So I like that feeling. But just watching just the sets and everything, it reminded me of like Giant, old movies like this. And this felt very much like a postmodern response to those old classic American tropes in movies, especially the romanticized masculinity in movies. It's like the John Waynes and such of the old days. And this movie obviously is about a man that is clearly struggling with something that has to do with masculinity, and he's using that, overcompensating, shall we say, through that testosterone. We don't understand a lot about him, but we do know very clearly that he has a strong distaste for women or just anything that is effeminate or soft in any way. And, this is going to be an obstacle for him, because all that is going to be embodied in the forms of Rose and Peter, because his brother gets married to Rose, and Rose is a widow, and she has a son named Peter. And they kind of fit that description, because her son is different. He has a bit of an awkwardness and a effeminate sort of quality to him. And through that, and a bit through the midsection, I found myself, while I'm watching it, initially feeling a little bit annoyed. I just found like, okay, I know what we're going for. It's like this very blatant subversion of these classic tropes, obviously, but it's a very kind of, it felt very much like a cut and dry sort of commentary on toxic masculinity. But Peter actually provides that opportunity for growth. I just worried it was going to go in a direction that I think it didn't need to go in, because naturally you just think, when these characters meet each other, there is something that catches their attention about each other. You're just not sure what it is, but you do assume that a romance is going to bloom. You think one might see some sort of vulnerability in the other and bring that out in a way that makes them evolve, but I really, really resisted that, again, as an idea, but it does completely surprise you because it does not go in the direction that you think it's going to, and I really love that. And I find myself constantly trying to figure out still what's going on there, especially in that third act that is really kind of a face-off between Phil and Peter, because it is, as I said, much more complex than it seems. You have a story about two people and they clearly mirror each other. So naturally, my first instinct is to think that, this is going to be a sort of self-actualization for Phil, now that he sees this young boy who reminds him of him when he's a bit younger. But I do think it's more kind of layered than that. I do think that they are two sides of a very vast spectrum when it does come to the concept of masculinity. When I look at Benedict Cumberbatch as Phil, though, I've never been a fan of Cumberbatch at all in terms of his acting. It's a very specific style. I think it works in things that are very campy, like Star Trek, and it can really work absolutely for Shakespeare and things like that on stage, but on film, it's never really translated for me. He has a quality to him that is, naturally very British. You get a sense it's like, oh, I've been trained at RADA or something like that, but there's something to his artifice that always leaves me very kind of disconnected. But I will say, in terms of just his facial features, it works so well for Phil, just because, like I said, he is very mysterious. So you can't have a character where you sense a lot in the eyes, and you really don't here. He's very disconnected in the eyes. He has almost like a reptilian face. The eyes are almost like black and beady. But I have to admit, as the movie went on, I started to, I guess, be okay with it a little bit more, the more that I learn about Phil, because there's something about the artificiality to him that's just slightly awkward and slightly quirky that I think does fit the character, because he is a character who is trying very hard to put on a sort of persona that may not necessarily reflect all that he is. So naturally, there's an aspect of him that is, a bit of a misfit. But yeah, when I think about Phil, I think about a shirt that almost fits but doesn't quite fit. And there's something about that just feels distracting throughout it. I still wish that another character, or I should say another actor, had played him. Obviously, he has this inner shame, and it comes out in some ways through this like viciousness towards women that, like I said, is embodied in a very Freudian sense in the character of Rose. And this is the character, unfortunately, that I struggle with. I like the character. I'm intrigued by her. I think she's played wonderfully by Kirsten Dunst, but I struggled with where her character went because I felt like you could have really explored kind of the dynamic between mother and son, how men view women in that sense, when they're boys growing up into men, and you see, both aspects to that. I just wish there had been a little bit more of that. I wish I had provided a little bit more padding for the character of Phil so we understand him a little bit more. And also we understand Peter a little bit more, because obviously he's very protective of his mother, but we get a little bit of insight into why, but not quite enough. We're always at a distance. It just felt like she was reduced to this catalyst that just gets steamrolled over by the patriarchy, just from a narrative perspective. I felt like we narrowed the scope with that character. And she's a very sad character. I think everything about what happens to her is very tragic throughout that middle section in particular. And I like that Kirsten Dunst, as she starts to unravel, she plays her with this real kind of delicacy and childlike innocence. She's like the one character who has this, something soft about her and emotional naturally, because she's a woman. But I do like that throughout that section, they really want to establish that Phil is the one in control. And so you're going to naturally think that it's going to carry over into the third act, and it does not. And then you realize that he's really not in control at all throughout the entire movie, even though he thinks that he is. And, it is planted, these seeds are planted little by little, the breadcrumbs, to where you realize it's Peter actually who holds the power for pretty much the whole movie. And we see it in different symbols and things, but I really think it's the score that does the best job of planting those seeds without you really realizing it. The score is, of course, by the great Johnny Greenwood, and it's a very, very reminiscent to like There Will Be Blood, but it's Yeah, it's very unnerving, very prickly, very plucky, literally very plucky. And I like that because it feels like we are caught between like the crosshairs of his comb, because he's always kind of like he's always kind of playing it, and it has that, it has that uneasy feeling to it, and that just consistently exists throughout that score in a way that's always keeping you on edge, it feels like. And I think the guy who plays Peter does just a tremendous job. I think the guy that plays Peter maybe gives one of the best performance in the film. I think he has the most difficult part to play here, because he really has to be a diversion. You begin thinking he's one person, and he turns out not to be, and he has to do it very, very subtly. And you don't realize it, sometimes not until after you've seen it. You still don't realize his sinister nature. And I think it's that subtlety and that ability to really give us that ambiguity without being too removed is absolutely brilliant, because he's a character you really want to follow and you're really interested in unpacking. And like I said, there's just these little hints of red flags with that character that did stick with me, and I knew they would obviously pay off, hopefully, in the third act. One of them, of course, being the rabbits, the slaughtering of the rabbits, which is a theme we've seen lately in a lot of movies. But the first one, gifting the rabbit to his mother, who, obviously is starved for this love and affection. And then he just kills it and dissects it. And I know that he is training to become a surgeon, but that's not sociopathic at all. And even in the scene where he kills the rabbit with Phil, he gently eases it in and then just kills it very mercilessly. And it's a very chilling sort of moment for me, but it does kind of reveal this character to be somebody who is very controlled, much more than you think he is. There's a very focused intelligence, and a person who's not afraid to take their time when it comes to kind of developing their ideas. And you sense kind of a bad boy in there, or somebody who is rebelling against mommy a little bit, as he does say in the film. And I do think, yes, he knows he's not like the other people. But I don't think that it brings him nearly as much shame or pain as it does somebody like Phil. I do think it brings him pain. I think we see kind of the realities of that in the beginning of the film. But beyond that, I think his confidence and his control is quite clear, and it's much more consistent and strong than somebody like Phil. Phil does say that he sees himself, in Peter naturally. He's like, oh, you remind me of when I was younger, and I absolutely believe that for sure. But I do think that there's a lot of things that he admires that he doesn't have. I think he does admire that perceptive quality to him, even though I think he went into things hoping to manipulate the kid. Knowing he holds a piece of information, he's seen a side to Phil, a vulnerable side that he can't allow to be seen by anybody else. So naturally, he's never in control from the beginning. It's about him trying to get that power back. But that final stretch where we really, spend time with those characters, especially the final scene, which is, partially funny. I swear to God, just like the amount of phallic symbolism in this movie it's hilarious. I found myself going like, am I supposed to be laughing at this? As they're passing that cigarette between each other, there's just so much going on there that, we want to understand. There is a strange attraction, absolutely, and a need to explore oneself through the other. Because, obviously there's certain things Phil has that Peter doesn't, and vice versa. But one must cancel the other due to a lot of that personal shame and that viciousness, that need to dominate. Because I do think they both share a need to be dominant, and obviously that can't exist in a relationship like this one. But I think it's the one that outright creates the violence due to his self-loathing and denial, that obviously has to be the one that can't survive. But it's also a very dark thing, because I do think that Phil does get that genuine emotion out. I do think he's able to tap into the vulnerable sides of him, but he doesn't realize it's not through a genuine gesture. I don't think it's through cynicism. At least I don't think he realizes it. But yeah, I found that to be very, very interesting. And again, a very bizarre moment that I won't forget for a while. But it leads us to a very disturbing, very eerie sort of ending that I think a lot of people are pondering a lot. I get that sense. I certainly am myself. But what I will say, this is a movie that demands multiple viewings, I think, to be able to understand just how everything plays out, when the seeds were planted, and how everything comes to fruition. And some things are becoming more clear when you see it a second time, but I find myself still having more questions than answers. And as I said, that can be a bit of a hindrance from the point of view of the viewer. But yeah, the ambiguity just becomes a little bit too much, I think. I wanted a little bit more padding, a little bit more meat to everything so that a lot of these motivations do make sense. Like the hides and how they're planted in the story, and when Rose obviously sells them, all of that felt a little bit abrupt and a little bit confusing and, like I said, a little bit disorienting from a plot standpoint. I just wish there was just a little bit stronger of a core so that when these motivations start to branch out from the tree, they feel organic, they make sense, and we can all bring it back to something. And so it leaves me kind of feeling a little bit mixed, a little bit empty in some ways, and then very satisfied in others. But overall, I do think the film is very compelling. It may not necessarily be the most enjoyable experience while I'm watching it. It's a very curious experience. It's one of a lot of intrigue, and it pulls you in little by little. But sometimes having that big build to the aha moment without that proper foundation throughout does leave things to be desired for me. So I found myself, really satisfied in some ways and maybe a little empty in other ways. But overall, I do think the movie is very interesting, and I do think it's worth your time, just because I was afraid it was going to go in a certain direction, and then it doesn't go in that direction, which provides a more interesting layered discussion when it comes to the idea of masculinity and the facets of it, because I don't think it's just a straight masculinity is bad and such. But yeah, I do think that this is a film that is absolutely worth your time, and it's on Netflix, so if you have it, check it out. And that is the review. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to plug my website as always. It is deepfocuslens.com. I am an artist and I do commission portraits and I sell prints of my work. If that's something that you're interested in, you can always go to the website below. And if you have a question about a commission or a print, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below as well. And I'd also like to give a shout out to my patrons who have been wonderful supporters. And if you are interested in becoming a patron, the link for that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.